So in terms of today's agenda, I'll do a very quick introduction before I hand over to Tom and then to Aisling. And we'll then have maybe 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A at the end, depending on how we get on. So for those of you who don't know me, I founded our consulting business, Iregan Advisors, about 3 years ago now. My background is in transport and mobility and parking. I've worked in the area for over 20 years. One of our business's specialisms is in parking and mobility strategy, and we've worked with the Department of Transport, the NTA, and well over half of Ireland's local authorities at this stage, including Wexford, which I'll talk about briefly in a few minutes. So I'm going to start with some very brief context to set the scene. Those of you who've been on previous webinars will be familiar with some of this detail, but I think it's really important to highlight the top level reminder. I guess probably everybody who's on this call is on this call. And that's, the climate action plan, the need for us to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. I think that's going to be a real challenge. The National Sustainable Mobility Policy, which I've no doubt almost all of us will be familiar with, and the components of that where we're trying to drive people to alternative modes of mobility. And today, obviously, we're going to look at Wexford, as I mentioned, as a really interesting case study. But I wanted to set the scene in terms of the whole ecosystem of sustainable and shared mobility. And, these are some examples of best practices from around Europe. A shared mobility hub here in Eindhoven, for example. And obviously, a big part of that transition, which we've been involved with in terms of Wexford, is digitalizing the curbsiding, capturing, what you've got in terms of the usage of your curbside. So how many meters or kilometers are dedicated to parking, how many are dedicated to loading, to shared mobility, and so on. And we had a previous talk about that. That's available on YouTube for those of you who didn't see it. But a lot of our work is around curbside digitalization, so capturing the inventory, setting goals for how you're going to use your curbside, and then managing how people access that. And I guess that's really important in terms of when you're starting to plan moves to shared mobility, or identifying locations for shared mobility hubs and so on. And just to hammer that point home, I suppose, the CAP24, the Climate Action Plan, really emphasise the role that you as local authorities are going to play or are playing in enabling that and operationalising that shift to other sustainable mobility modes. So won't go through all that, but I think it's probably you're probably very familiar with that now at this stage, in terms of what your role is in that picture. And in terms of when you start to look at what your options are, I guess there are so many different options out there. I know that there are goals to to enable up 200 and more mobility hubs across the country. I know that some local authorities are very advanced in terms of their planning of that and their operationalizing of that. Some are exploring it, some are assessing it. So I hope today, in terms of what you'll hear about the concept in Wexford, I hope that there's food for thought in that for all of you today. And this screenshot here just gives you an idea of the different options, the different solutions that are available internationally. There's so many different solutions to choose from. It can sometimes be difficult to know where to start. And in terms of shared mobility and in terms of sustainable mobility, I suppose Wexford County Council have been doing a huge amount in this area, and we've partnered with them in terms of reviewing their parking policy and strategy. We've advised on digitalizing the curbside and improving the availability of data from things like parking machines, parking apps, and so on, because that data can really support and complement the work that you're doing in planning or in managing other things like shared mobility, for example. And I'm delighted that we have Tom from Wexford here to talk about that today. So I'm going to hand over initially to Tom, who is a chartered engineer. He works in the active travel department of Wexford County Council currently. Tom started his career in private industry, working for a large contractor, and worked in civils projects in pharma, commercial, food, oil, and so on. He's with Wexford County Council since 2020 and in the active travel area there since 2022. So over to you, Tom.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
That's good, yeah.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here today. As I said, here as Aisling is, we have the slides here. If we can roll on to the first one to get straight in. In Wexford County Council and Bold in May in 2023, launched a trial e-bike sharing scheme with an initial fleet of 50 bikes. And the rationale for that was a bike per every 400 population, and with that parking every 300 meters. So initially, what we have now is 42 parking locations, and these are a mix of 23 in public locations and 19 on private grounds around the town. So the 23 in the public locations, they were located really on wider footpaths. We were careful maybe not to cause any obstruction, especially to those with vision impairments. And they were marked out quite simply. They were line marked and set out on the ground. And where feasible, we used the bike racks that were currently in place. After that, for the 19 private locations, we reached out to, let's say, the supermarkets, the hospitals, healthcare centres, commercial areas, hotels, educational zones, to see if they would allow us to get a parking spot on their grounds. And in general, they were more than happy to do so, especially the hotels and the supermarkets. And we even had some of the supermarkets ask for exclusivity on the car parking. So once we had indemnity, the scheme took about 12 weeks to set up. And once we'd agreed indemnity with the private landowners, we were able to move on ourselves and agree service contract, indemnity and insurance details with Bold pre-trial. And then Bold, in that regard, would submit a monthly usage report to ourselves. Just click on there, Aisling. So just in the operation and setup of it, that obviously the parking is quite important on it, and there were three sort of various modes, operational modes for parking. If you can click on there, Aisling. The initial, you can see there, there's a tethered option, similar to the ones we see in our cities, in Dublin, Cork, etc. Hard infrastructure needed at the parking location. The second one there is a free float, which allows users to hire and off-hire the unit from any location. So you can just deposit back the unit on the side of the street. It wasn't something we were in favour of. And the last one then was a geofenced one we went with. You can see the picture there. They're a very simply laid out parking spot. They're marked on the ground. Signage, if possible, to highlight the area. It's geofence model, and the user hires and off hires the bike located spot. I think initially we were about 3,800 to set up the 42 locations, so it was very minimal to start off with. And scooters to be returned to these spots. We don't necessarily advertise them. They're on the app. they become known within the app, within the user group. And then for the user to off-hire, they have to take a picture of the scooter parked. So we have a 95% compliance in parking for the scooters. And then the scooters and the bikes have an automatic internal lock when not in use. So as the scheme progressed and as the usage data back. Hello. Back.
We lost you there just for a second, Tom. You're back, I think.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, sorry. So, as the scheme progressed, as usage data became available, we added in some Sheffield bike stands to some of the more popular locations. And this was especially in locations we felt could be a bit more formal and could accommodate private bikes as well. I think at this stage, it is important to say that a good local app is key to success of the trial. You know, we don't have any hard infrastructure. The batteries on the bikes have to be replaced. You know, they have a 40-kilometer range, but an average trip is 2.4 kilometers. So the batteries need to be changed intermittently. Bolt would manage and monitor the operations. They monitor the user behavior and record the trip data. Let's see if we can slide on there. Ashley. I think an important aspect of it as well is the GPS control and the fluidity of the scheme. For example, almost recently we hosted the FLA in Wexford Town, which saw over 600,000 people on the streets of the town. Large areas were pedestrianised, and for that FLA, we were able to change and remove, resize parking locations. We were able to create non-operational zones, no-go areas. We were able to control the driving speed of the units. We made new parking locations at park and rides, at campsites, and once the agreement was in place, this was changed in minutes. And it was done, you know. So it's a very fluid scheme. And in addition to that, we can shut down the operations, let's say for a major weather event, for a red weather warning, we can shut it down. But I would have to say that even in local recent weather events, rainy days, the scooters and the bikes were still recording trips, you know, so they were still being used. And you can see on the slide there, for the town, anywhere in red, you can't operate. And I think you can see, if you can just notice on the map, there are two red areas and our beautiful quay front as well, which for obvious reasons it's open to water. The quay front is open to water, so it's restricted there. And just very so slightly as well, there are two yellow areas there on the map. They are pedestrianised areas, pedestrianised streets, and the speed is reduced to 10 kilometers an hour for those areas. If we can slide on then, and moving on to the scooters. We integrated the scooters into our fleet in August in 2024, again for a 6-month trial period, and they were brought in on the same operational platform as the e-bikes. So they were just integrated. They comply with all the legislations. They have a battery range of 40 kilometers an hour. They're limited to 20 kilometers an hour. And I suppose we noticed immediately that they were used immediately, and very quickly they started outperforming the bikes. So much so, take for example last month, 4,148 kilometers were carried out on bikes, whereas there was 7,447 by each scooter. So they're very popular. And I think the interesting thing as well is that the average journey for bike and scooter is almost the same, at about 2.4 kilometers per trip. So there are significant journeys, and they're identical almost. And I think it's important to point out that the average speed of the scooter is slower than the average speed of the bike. And so the user is choosing to use the scooter, even though it takes them longer. An average of about 1.5 minutes longer per trip than the bike. If you can slide on, Aisling, just as regards challenges and improvements then.
Am I on the right slide now? Challenges and improvements?
Sorry, back.
Yeah, we have you back, Tom. Yeah.
Back. Sorry about that. Sorry, everyone. So just as regards improvements or challenges along the way, I would advise, let's say, just in hindsight, that an audit and review of the parking locations is done continuously. For a couple of reasons, we found that we could maybe choose new parking locations, change parking locations as the scheme progressed. And the second reason as well is that we could audit it. We did face accusations that the bikes were left thrown down or scooters were thrown down, but an audit of the locations quickly dispelled that, and we found a 95% compliance with the parking. I suppose Wexford were the first LA to implement the scheme. The launch attracted a lot of local and media attention, and the media attention continued on for a few days. My own feeling on it is that the initial weeks of both the scooter and the bike schemes were very similar. We had reports of misuse, poor driver behaviour, maybe some underage users. But as the weeks progressed in both schemes, these reports seemed to dissipate, and we actually received very few reports and complaints about the schemes. We met with the Gardaí about 6 weeks after the implementation of the scooter scheme. They indicated that reports had been minimal for both bikes and scooters. They were quite positive towards the scheme. Insofar as for them, the scooters were regulated. They complied with all the legislation as opposed to e-scooters. And with that, there was a reporting feature on it, and both can monitor driver behaviour. They can and have taken action against certain users. And with that, the public can report the users directly to Bolt. And I would imagine if anyone was to pursue the scheme again, I would recommend that to get the data, there is quite an amount of data on the Bolt, and to get that out on social media, it's very hard to counteract hard data. It's very hard to challenge it, especially from maybe when you're getting comments that may not be from private or public, maybe from private use or public use. You just don't know. As regards conclusions then, Aisling, I would say Wexford County Council are very satisfied with the trials to date. We've completed over 160,000 kilometres travelled with the bikes and scooters. I think we're almost at 30,000 kilometres with the scooters alone. We get a lot of powerful data from the schemes. We can identify popular origin destination locations in the town. We will use those to inform our transport plan, which is currently underway. The scheme was quick to establish. It was readily used. It was welcomed by local businesses and well regulated, I have to say. And the scooters appear more popular than the bikes. And I would say that the critical to it is a good maintenance team, and we were lucky to have that in Wexford Town as well. And that's it. I'll hand you over to Aisling then. So any questions at the end?
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for that, Tom. So my name is Aisling Dunne, as mentioned there, and I'm going to speak to you about this scheme more so, I suppose, from the Bolt perspective and what we have done and what we can do. I noticed there's a few people on the call here, Jeanette from Carlow and Jim from Wicklow, and I think also Brenda from Sligo. So for some of you, this might be very repetitive. I have probably already gone through a lot of this for you, but hopefully there'll be a little bit of interesting information still. So I suppose very quickly, just to introduce, I suppose, Bolt and what a lot of other shared mobility operators are trying to do. As shared transport platforms, Bolt in particular, we're in 50 countries, we're operating in 600 cities across the world, predominantly Europe, Africa, but we're also moving into Asia and South America. But we provide a full range of different shared mobility services, and each of those services, I suppose, targets a slightly different type of journey. And you can see there, you know, depending on your range, the expectation is that e-scooters are for that kind of a 2 to 3 kilometer trip, slightly longer for the e-bike, in that people tend to be open to taking those longer trips on the e-bike. If they're not available or you're going for a longer trip, either taxis or car sharing. And this is to all supplement public transport and walking, and to try and build towns and cities where private car ownership can be reduced. The reasons for this and why we think this is a really important contribution to towns and cities is that it can provide that kind of first and last mile connectivity, those shared mobility, micro-mobility options. They can connect you into public transport. And I think, you know, certainly in Wexford, certain bus locations for buses that are regional connections have been found to be hotspots for our bikes and scooters, meaning they're helping to get people to those buses and then on for the rest of their journey. And they also bring with them health benefits. I know some people say, oh, if it's electric, it's not quite as much of a workout, but it's getting you more active and getting out of your car. And certainly has mental health benefits from my perspective. Always nice to feel the wind in your hair. So ultimately, there are some of the benefits of it. A big one is the reduced need in towns and cities for on-street parking. Some of the parking spaces that have been allocated for our shared bike schemes, you can put 10 bikes or scooters into the equivalent of one parking space. So if you can manage to repurpose a parking space without too much upheaval from the local community or too much opposition, you can effectively make space for 10 shared micromobility vehicles. So who are we targeting and who are we all targeting when we're trying to think about shared micromobility? It is that 71% of trips that are being taken in private car. And they're the ones that, depending on the type of trip, depending on the options available to them, we want to see more and more of them using micromobility. One of the biggest challenges, I suppose, to the rollout of schemes like this is making sure that it's a safe service and that it doesn't have negative consequences for any other road users. So I think the principle of trying to provide people with alternative to private cars is widely accepted. The idea of them being electric solutions, widely acceptable. The part that people kind of get stuck on is, how do we make sure it's safe for users and how do we make sure it's safe for everyone else? And from our perspective in Bolt, and as I say, many other shared micromobility operators, there isn't like one silver bullet that solves it. There isn't like, oh, you just do this and then everything runs smoothly. It is a kind of multi-pronged approach. So there is an element of enforcement required. Tom mentioned that we have geofenced control parking. Our parking, it's controlled through GPS. The bike needs to be in a specific location, one of the 42 parking locations. If the bike or the scooter isn't in that location, your app will not give you the option to end my trip. If you can't end your trip, you continue to pay for your trip. So that is in effect a fine. So if somebody decides to just pull up outside their place of work and park the bike there, throw the bike there and not properly finish their trip in a parking location, they'll get charged what is called a long order, which is about €21, effectively a fine. And that counts as our enforcement. If it happens to someone once, they won't do it a second time. Obviously, if somebody comes to us through customer support and says they had an issue or they didn't understand, you know, we're flexible on the first time, but beyond that, there's quite strict enforcement. And I think that has what's contributed to our very, very high level of compliance with the rules. So there has to be, it has to be firm, and that's very important for us. There's obviously a big piece around education and raising awareness, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. The parking infrastructure Tom has mentioned, and I think it is hugely important. And I'll just dip into the parking infrastructure piece now, because we've undertaken some research in 2022 with IFOP, International Research Organization, and it was a European parking survey undertaken with, and the overwhelming information we got back from it, that the reason for poor parking was the lack of clarity on where to park and insufficient parking space. And they're the key reasons given for poor parking. So that's really useful. That just means we know exactly what we need to do to make sure that we can have schemes that have well-controlled, well-regulated parking, which removes some of the biggest piece of opposition that you will see to e-bikes or e-scooters. So in the Bolt app, when you first register, you will be advised on how to use the bike safely. There's icons there at the top that show you, and then the second row explains how to park. So making sure there are clear instructions for the user, that you're not expecting them to just understand this system, especially if they'll have seen photos of or experienced other European cities that have a free floating parking model. They might think it's the same. That might be both for users and for other people in your community who might fear the worst. So it's really important that it's very clearly explained that in Ireland we operate a controlled parking system, and it's for the benefit of users and non-users. In addition to both the control from a GPS perspective, so I won't go into explaining what GPS is because I would do a terrible job of it, especially on a call with a lot of engineers. But in addition to having that technical control, we also use AI as part of our Park Assist. So this is an end-of-ride picture that we require from our users to prove that the bike or the e-scooter has been left in a standing position, because unfortunately, even when you get people to comply with putting them in the geofenced controlled area, sometimes people just leave them on their side. While that doesn't necessarily create impediments for people, if they're all in a controlled corralled area, it doesn't look nice. It gives the impression of kind of clutter, or it just looks like it's unkept. So we want to make sure that everyone who's parking a bike is leaving it in upright position, and that it's within the green lines, where there are green lines for a designated area, and that it hasn't been left outside of the area it's supposed to. That end of ride picture has, it's tested against hundreds of thousands of pictures that we have gathered over the last number of years, and is used to ensure that we have a very high level of parking compliance. So I touched on some of the other prongs to our approach to safety, and one of them is around technology and integrating that with education. So we use a reckless rider score for our e-scooter users, and so this is where if our software calculates that poor behavior is being done by our users, so if that's skidding, unnecessary braking, fall or a collision, anything that would lead our telematics on the scooter to detect that this is being misused, or that the scooter rider is not taking appropriate care, we can implement a system where we provide warnings. It's a three-strike system ultimately, where at the second stage of it there is education piece to allow a user to come back up the rungs of the strike system. So for example, in Wexford, we have currently 47 users that are on strike 1. So they have been warned that their behavior has flagged that they are riding recklessly. We have 5 riders on strike 2, and we have currently blocked 15 riders from the app in Wexford since launching. Now, some of that is because we have detected tandem riding, which is where there are 2 people on 1 scooter. That's done using data over a number of trips to detect whether the weight changes have indicated that it's gone from being a 1-person trip to a 2-person trip. Some of those blocks are also because we received notification. So we have a reporting system, and we've received an email or a message through the app to say, on this street at this time, I saw 2 people on a scooter. We, using our data, can quickly detect what trip that was, contact the rider, say, you're tandem riding, that's not acceptable on our platform, and block them. Now, there are ways for them to get back on, and as I said, you know, we operate an education piece, so they can go through the Bolt Rider Academy, get them to understand the danger of bad behaviour, and make them complete a process, and then in due course get back on the app. But the purpose of this is, I suppose, and the reason to highlight all this is there's a high level of control that can be exercised by all of the platforms, whether it's Bolt or one of our other competitors. There is a much higher level of control that we can exert on users to ensure the highest possible level of behavior. And that is not something that's possible with private use. And so that is a big distinguishing feature, and something which, you know, not only are you providing a service, but you're also providing a much more controlled service. I think Tom mentioned, just when we were talking about some of the safety features, a really important one is making sure that when there are weather events, people aren't at risk on the bikes or scooters, or they're not creating risk for the road users. So during any weather events in Ireland, our speeds are reduced down to 20 for yellow. So that's the e-bikes go from a max of 25 down to 20. E-scooters are already capped at 20. In an orange, they go down to 15. And in a red weather warning, we pause all operations. That's to keep users safe and to stop them, you know, being at risk, maybe who aren't fully aware of how bad the weather is. As Tom mentioned, we see still some very hardy people out in the yellows and the oranges, though, even if it's a little bit slower. And that's, I suppose, a sign of how people have come to rely on the service to get them from A to B, and it's a key part of their operations. I'll just touch on one last safety feature before I move on, and that's just cognitive reaction testing. Again, this has become more standard in the industry. We've been doing it now for a number of years, and that is an online quiz in the app during certain hours, and that must be completed before the e-bike or the e-scooter will be unlocked. So in most of our towns, that's between, say, 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. During times that we would expect that people might have been consuming alcohol. And we just want to make sure that they haven't had a few too many drinks and then get on the bike or the scooter and endanger themselves and others. I will say it's very adaptable. So during Freshers Week, for example, in Sligo, I think Brendan's there, but during Freshers Week in the past, we have changed those hours to bring it down to maybe 3 p.m. and have it run through the day to account for, you know, it's Freshers Week. People might be enjoying themselves a bit earlier in the day. So that's very adaptable. So again, if a council comes to us and says, there's an event on, there's something happening, we want cognitive reaction testing on all day, that's fine. We can do it again at the touch of a button. In general, it tends to operate from around the 10 p.m. time. And interestingly, during those hours in the month of December, about 15% of trips don't go ahead because of it. So you see a much higher failure rate during months or times of the year that you would expect to see that, because people are probably having more drinks. And that's, to us, a kind of a positive sign. It's a sign the test works. It's a sign people have to do it, and then people have to find an alternative way home without endangering themselves on a bike or scooter. So it's one of the positive features that a number of operators are doing now, and again adds to that level of control. The scooter there, that's the scooter that we're operating in Ireland, just to flag that all scooters now under new legislation need to be a maximum weight of 25 kg and travel at a max speed of 20 kilometers. There are some of the key kind of features. I think I've already touched on tandem riding detection. The last thing is just, Tom mentioned there, raising awareness. And that's something that, you know, especially for something that's new in a country, as e-scooters are, it's really important that we ensure that people fully are aware of the features, how it can work safely, how their behavior is important. You know, there is an element of still personal responsibility. You need to make sure you use it appropriately, but what the safety features are. And that's helpful both for users and non-users to give them comfort that there is a lot of control in place. So we've been running ads in Wexford. We have run ads in the newspaper, on the radio, just trying to raise awareness around some of the features. And I think that's had a positive effect on some of the early concerns or or fear that we had. The council has been, providing information through their social media platforms. We've been taking ad space in newspapers and on the radio, so that the general public appreciate that there are differences between maybe private scooters, which are also great, but just need that the private or that the public shared scooters have a greater level of control and are dealt with differently. So I might just run you really quickly through some data just to give you an idea of the scale or the kind of numbers that the scooters and bikes are doing. So in November, as Tom sort of mentioned there, we've seen that since the launch of these scooters in August, they have really overtaken the e-bikes in terms of utilisation. So we had 1,500 trips taken on e-bikes and over 3,000 trips taken on the e-scooters in the month of November. We also had, you can just look there at the distance travelled on the e-bikes, just under 3,500 kilometres, still a good distance, and those bikes are still being used. But again, about approximately half the distance being travelled on the e-scooters. In terms of unique users, 520 unique users in November, 520 people in a not particularly large from a not particularly large cohort of people, but 735 using the scooters. And then just touching on, as you can see there, the distance in kilometres travelled between the e-bike and the e-scooter. It's the exact type of trip that we're targeting. It's that under 3 kilometres. We want to get people out of their cars. It's what would be considered maybe a longish walk if people don't have time to get to their connecting form of public transport. What is interesting is that people are willing to take that bit of extra time and that little bit of extra expense, because it takes longer on an e-scooter to get there than an e-bike, and such is their enthusiasm to use e-scooters that they're consistently doing that as a preference. And then as Tom mentioned, it's a full minute longer on the e-scooter to make that trip. And overall, since we commenced operations in Wexford in May 2023, we've had just under 5,500 users, which for a town the size of Wexford, and obviously considering that some have also been tourists and people visiting the area, that's quite a significant number. And overall together, they have travelled 160,926 kilometres, which is a really significant contribution towards reducing car kilometres travelled in Wexford over the last year and a half, and something we're very proud of being able to help. I think I'll just finish up. Tom mainly dealt with the parking aspect of this, but just from our perspective and our experience from operating in everywhere from, abroad, but also particularly in Ireland, Carlow, Bray, Sligo, Wexford, Dunleary, we're in a number of places around Ireland, but the mandatory parking locations, I feel, work very well in Ireland. We've had discussions with the NTA about, how other operators have been doing tethering. That does have a requirement for an awfully well spread out Sheffield stand network. That has high costs for the local authority. And if there aren't sufficient Sheffield stands, then you have, bikes being tethered to poles or to gates or to railings, which is less than ideal. Whereas the virtual parking bay solution, I think, really delivers that kind of hybrid between high level of control, but low level of investment for the local authority and speed at which it can be rolled out. So for that reason, I think mandatory parking locations are essential so that it's controlled and we don't have street clutter. But I think virtual parking bays provide that flexibility and that speed that maybe a tethered base system doesn't. Having said all that, you need to have adequate parking density. If you are trying to create a convenient service and you have your parking density, every 500 meters that there's a parking location, that's only going to work for the people who live very near one and are going to very near the other. Otherwise, they'll just, like if there's a car in the driveway, they'll take that option if it's an awful lot more convenient. And that's what you're, trying to avoid. So parking density is hugely important. Having that appropriate parking infrastructure, and by that I just mean clarity. If there's a dual use for a Sheffield stand, that's very clear to users. If it is what was once a car parking space and is now being expected for bikes, it needs to be marked with big green or yellow or whatever color paint you want, and a bike symbol in the middle. It needs to be clear for users where they're expected to go. And then the utilisation of private land in addition to public land has been really helpful for us in all the local authority areas that we've operated in. It's really helped connect in shopping centres, hotels, and we've received really particularly positive feedback from hotels about how it creates a real added bonus for their guests and for their staff. So definitely something always to explore when looking at having them in. And then to conclude, what next? Just in Wexford specifically, we'll be undertaking a modal shift survey in the next few weeks to try and get a better understanding of, if an e-bike or an e-scooter hadn't been available to this person, how else would they have travelled? What trip are we replacing? Are we replacing walking, which isn't exactly our target, or are we replacing private car trips, which is our target? Obviously, 100% of the trips will not be, replacing private cars. The Department of Transport have told us in the past that anything over 7% private car replacement ratio or percentage is a high one by international norms. So we're hoping to see that. We'll also be reviewing the trial at the end of the 6 months, which will be coming up in the next 2 months. So there'll be a piece of work for all of us to do on that. We're looking at a partnership with the local Gardaí, who have suggested that they might use the e-scooters from time to time while on the beat, so that they can, I suppose, be able to better chat to the local community, be more accessible than they would be in a car. And I think there's a lot of challenges for guards to be on bikes. It's quite an arduous process to be a mountain bike guard, but they think being able to use the scooters might be a way to do it quite conveniently. So we're really keen to support that. And then there's an ongoing long-term discussion that's happening with the NTA, and I'm sure many of the local authorities that are here on this call have also been engaging with the NTA. We know that there is an upcoming framework happening for the TFI regional bike schemes. We believe that the NTA then intends to look at the smaller local authorities outside of the Cork, Galway, Limerick, Waterford current TFI regional bike schemes, but we think that's probably still a few years away. And in the meantime, there's a lot of local authorities that are, trying to figure out how they provide that shared mobility and how operators can do so. So, ongoing discussion there. That's probably everything from me. But if anyone has any questions, and I'm sorry if I went on too long.
That's great, Aisling. Thanks very much.